Gigantosaurus can be an intimidating creature to face off against, being a 5-mana 10/10, but did you know it barely even qualifies as having one of the top 10 highest creature powers in Magic the Gathering? For this list, we'll be considering non-token printed creatures in Magic based solely on their power. The lower spots on this list are ties, so the more contenders there are, the less attention they'll get individually. The 10th highest creature power in Magic the Gathering is 9. There are 41 creatures with a base power of 9, 2 of which were released relatively recently in Duskmourn, Altanak and Valgavoth, along with other big creatures like demons, Eldrazi, beasts, and worms. There's also the wildly expensive Draco, which has one of the highest mana costs of any card in the game. Moving on to the 9th highest power in Magic, we have 10. I know, 10 is 9 and 9 is 10. The numbers will clear up a little after this because each list keeps getting smaller and smaller. There are only 34 creatures with a base power of 10, and these include the usual suspects like Eldrazi, such as Ulamog, some elementals, some giants, and some hydras, including the legendary Progenitus. There's also the really interesting artifact creature called Leveler, whose ETB exiles your entire library. We can't forget the aforementioned Gigantosaurus, who's in the company of some other dinos here as well. Now that we're in the double digits, these lists of creatures will keep getting shorter, so we can take a closer look at each card going forward. The 8th highest creature power is 11. There are 9 creatures in Magic with a printed power of 11. This group starts with the infamous Blightsteel Colossus, an artifact creature with the power to end the game in one unblocked swing thanks to its infectability. There's Daemogoth Titan, which costs only 4 hybrid black and green mana but forces you to sacrifice a creature when attacking or blocking. Darksteel Colossus is unfortunately not quite as potent as its Blightsteel counterpart. Denizen of the Deep is a serpent that bounces all other creatures you control. Etali Primal Conqueror starts out as a 7/7, but for 9 generic and 1 Phyrexian green mana, it transforms into Etali Primal Sickness, which dishes out poison counters. It That Betrays has one of the most metal names in the entire game and is an Eldrazi with Annihilator 2 that steals enemy permanents. Polar Kraken is a relic of a time in Magic when an 11/11 was so powerful that it justified coming into play tapped and a cumulative upkeep of sacrificing a land, but at least it got trample. Titanoth Rex is a dinosaur beast with trample and cycling that can give one of your creatures trample if it's cycled. Lastly, there's Void Winnower, another Eldrazi that locks out your opponent from using cards with even converted mana costs. The 7th highest creature power in Magic is 12. These lists were supposed to be getting smaller, but there are actually 12 creatures in Magic with this power, which I think is really fitting and I hope it never changes. Ancient Stone Idol has flash and costs 1 less to cast per attacking creature, plus it can replace itself with a construct that has half its power. Arixmethes Slumbering Isle is a legendary kraken for only 4 mana that enters with 5 slumber counters. It's treated as a land until you cast 5 spells to remove all slumber counters from it, which I think is excellent mechanical flavoring. Emrakul, the World Anew, is a legendary Eldrazi that steals all your opponent's creatures but forces you to sacrifice them if it dies. Galta and Maverin is a dinosaur-vampire duo that can create either dinosaur or vampire tokens when attacking. There's also Galta Primal Hunger that can be summoned for less mana the more total creature power you control, and Galta Stampede Tyrant, which can flood the board with creatures from your hand on summon. Hierophant Biotitan is a Tyranid from the Warhammer 40k universe with some unique abilities. Jokul Mortar is a Leviathan that comes into play tapped and requires you to sacrifice 5 lands to keep it. It also doesn't untap automatically, only when you play an island, making it a pretty overcosted creature. Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, and Kozilek, the Great Distortion are both 12/12 legendary Eldrazi creatures, both of which draw you cards. Butcher of Truth has Annihilator 4 and shuffles itself back into the library from the graveyard, while Great Distortion has Menace and can counter spells via discard. Phyrexian Dreadnought costs a measly 1 mana for a 12/12 with trample, but you have to sacrifice creatures with total power of 12 or more, or it dies. Okay, for 1 mana that feels a little more reasonable than Jokul Mortar. Finally, Quakestrider Ceratops only costs 3 generic and 3 green mana for a 12/8 vanilla dinosaur. Okay, with the big ties behind us, now we can really settle in and get cozy with the following cards. 6th place is a 5-way tie between 5 creatures with a power of 13. Death's Shadow is a 13/13 avatar for 1 black mana. What's the catch? Well, it gets -X/-X, where X is your life total. This makes Death's Shadow a much better late game card, really more of a Hail Mary than anything else. A classic card to combo with Death's Shadow is Varol's the Scarstride. By exiling Death's Shadow from the graveyard, you can give an instant +13/+13 buff to any creature for just 1 black mana. Pretty solid. Elbrus the Binding Blade is a legendary artifact that gives equipped creature +1/+0. However, when it deals combat damage to a player, Elbrus detaches and transforms into Withengar Unbound. Withengar Unbound is a 13/13 legendary demon with Flying, Intimidate, and Trample. Its power and toughness both increase by 13 whenever a player loses the game, making it an even bigger threat in the multiplayer format Commander. Emrakul, the Promised End, is a legendary Eldrazi creature that costs 1 less to cast for each card type in your graveyard. It has the very unique, extremely powerful effect to gain control of target opponent during that player's next turn. Emrakul also has Flying, Trample, and Protection from instants, meaning it can't even be directly countered by an opponent's instant removal. Emrakul, the Promised End, is aptly named. When it hits the battlefield, it's not likely that the target opponent will even survive long enough to take their extra turn. Krosan Cloudscraper is a beast mutant for 7 generic and 3 green mana, and it doesn't do much except force you to pay 2 green mana at the beginning of each upkeep or sacrifice it. It does have a morph ability where you can play it as a face-down 2/2 for 3 generic mana, then you can pay its full summoning cost -1 green mana to turn it face up. Basically, at best, it's a 10 mana 13/13 that's somehow worse than a vanilla. Finally, we have Ludovic's Test Subject, a 0/3 lizard with Defender. If you pay 1 generic and 1 blue mana, it gains a hatchling counter. Once it has 5+ hatchling counters, it transforms into Ludovic's Abomination, a 13/13 lizard horror with Trample. Essentially, without the ability to increase hatchling counters via some other means like proliferating, you're looking at paying 6 generic and 6 blue mana for a 13/13. But it does have Trample, so that sweetens the deal a bit. We're now halfway through the list. Can you guess what the largest creature power will be? What about the second largest? Drop your guess in the comments below, and no cheating. At 5th place, we have just 2 creatures with a power of 15. Emrakul, the Aeon's Torn, is a 15/15 legendary Eldrazi. It can't be countered, allows you to take an extra turn, has Flying, protection from spells with 1 or more colors, and Annihilator 6. If that weren't enough, if it somehow gets sent to the graveyard, it shuffles the entire graveyard back into the library along with it. It's such a powerful card that it's only legal in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and either illegal or banned in every other Magic format. Worldspine Wurm costs 8 generic and 3 green mana to summon a 15/15 worm with Trample. When it dies, it spawns 3 5/5 green worm tokens that also have Trample, and then Worldspine Wurm gets shuffled back into the library. Flavor-wise, its ability seems to be a reference to worm regeneration. Even if it gets cut into thirds, those 3 pieces each become their own worm. Talk about a great way to get some extra value on death. Speaking of worms, there's another one hogging 4th place on today's list with a power of 16. Impervious Great Worm costs 1 less generic mana to summon than its Worldspine counterpart, making it even cheaper to summon since you can also tap creatures for mana, and it has Indestructible to boot. On a 16/16, that definitely limits your opponent's options for getting rid of it. Despite the creature's name, it is still, well, pervious to getting exiled or having its toughness reduced to 0 with -1/-1 counters, so there's that. The third highest creature power is 18. Yargle and Multani is a legendary frog spirit elemental with 18 power and 6 toughness. This vanilla creature costs 3 generic, 2 black, and 1 green mana to summon, and it's a combination of the creatures Yargle, Glutton of Urborg, and Multani, Yavimai's avatar. Being a vanilla creature with 6 toughness for 6 mana isn't great, but that 18 power is no joke, especially if you have a way to give it Flying, Trample, Indestructible, or really any ability that would give it more utility. Yargle and Multani does have the distinction of being the non-joke card with the highest power currently in the game. What do I mean by that? Well, you'll see with the next 2 creatures on today's list. The second highest creature power in Magic is 99. BFM, Big Furry Monster, is a creature so big that it's split between 2 cards, both of which must be played at once. If either card leaves the battlefield, the other must be sacrificed. It costs a whopping 15 black mana to summon a 99/99, the biggest, baddest, nastiest, scariest creature you'll ever see. It has a buffed up version of the keyword ability Menace. Instead of being unblockable except by 2 or more creatures, your opponent will need 3 creatures to block your BFM. This 2-card creature is not legal in any format, and for good reason. It was released in the set Unglued, one of the unsets. These are a series of Magic the Gathering expansions featuring joke cards that could never really work in any officially sanctioned gameplay and are mostly just for fun. Speaking of joke cards that could never work, we now arrive at the highest creature power in all of Magic the Gathering, a spot that is mathematically unlikely to be topped ever. The highest creature power in Magic is Infinity. Infinity Elemental is an elemental creature that costs 4 generic and 3 red mana to summon. It has infinite power and 5 toughness. In fact, it's so infinite that its flavor text says, it's so infinite that its flavor text says, it's so infinite that its flavor text says, it's so infinite that its flavor... Sorry, I don't know what came over me. Infinity Elemental was first released in the expansion Unstable, but has seen reprints in the 2 subsequent unsets, Unsanctioned and Unfinity. It features one of the most meta and unique artworks of any card in Magic, and its infinite power is so great that it's even popping out of the frame to singe its own card text. Some infinities might be larger than others, but unless a future unset prints a creature with a power of infinity +1, Infinity Elemental will likely keep its crown as the most powerful Magic the Gathering creature of all time. If you like cardboard content, a great way to see more of it is to do the usual stuff down below.